So we're delighted to be joined now by Tym Syrytczyk from Paradigm Junction. Tim, you've just started a fascinating new Substack all about driverless cars. So we thought, well, this is the perfect time to check in on self-driving and driverless cars. It's felt like they're on the way for quite a long time now. We see videos of San Francisco being transformed by this thing. And you're arguing that London could be this next big deal. But a little while ago, we spoke to Ruth Cadbury, the chair of the Transport Select Committee, and she seemed, I think, a little bit sceptical about self-driving cars becoming the sort of this big deal thing. So can you fill us in? How's it going in Britain in terms of driverless? Are we close to having these sorts of cars on our roads?
Are we ready is one question, and is it real is another question. And first, I'm going to go maybe with a slightly easy to answer question of, does this technology exist? And as you've mentioned, it is in San Francisco. In fact, it is in several US cities now. It started in Phoenix in 2017 with Waymo, this Google subsidiary, and now expanded over to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia more recently as well, with plans for New York City, the Big Apple, Denver, Colorado, even Oregon as well, Seattle, and to be precise. But more importantly for me and my research, this isn't just some loss-making experiment of big tech in Silicon Valley. It's also a piece of technology that is being developed here in Europe and also in China, meaning that actually this isn't an all eggs in one basket situation. In fact, there are people who are looking for the commercial use cases, from airports to taxis to public transport. There are people doing it in the European Union and also far abroad as well.
So let's zoom up a little bit and paint the picture here. So you wrote a really interesting piece on your Substack recently about how in the next year or so, London's roads, perhaps even Bedfordshire's roads, could be very, very different. So what's going on? How do you expect that kind of vision to change over the next year or two?
Yeah, so it's good to get the major player on board here. The startup and self-driving company Wave, which is developed here in London, based somewhere near King's Cross. And they have been developing this technology for many, many years now and have been able now to say, we want to publicly commercialize this. The same way as Waymo has set up a robotaxi model where you can ride-hail a vehicle to support you from getting point A to B, the Department for Transport looked very carefully at all the regulation and requirements to see if this is a safe thing to do, and they've set up a timeline. And from spring next year, there's going to be, on the Uber app, commercial vehicles available via the Wave vehicles on nice little Jaguars, at least for now. And so
We do like a Jaguar on this podcast, so...
yes, I am familiar, in fact. However, this leads to some sort of commercial race, as nobody wants a certain company to get all the money if you can get some money yourself. So the large player Waymo has been hiring quite relentlessly for fleet operations lead, policy UK lead. And it's a little bit suspicious as to why would you need these people if you wouldn't want to operate in London.
It's funny, I sent Waymo an email a few weeks ago saying, can I have a go when you launch here? Basically, I was basically just trying to get a go on a Waymo, and then the response was very much, "Oh no, we've not announced any plans, honest," with a lot of sort of suspicious eyes swaying to the sides. But it certainly sounds like we're going to get Waymo here. That seems like a pretty much done deal, right?
Yes, I think it is pretty likely, largely because one key detail here is that Uber is this benchmark as to whether a city is available for this ride-hailing sort of service, and London is one of its top-performing cities globally. There are millions and millions on the line here, and there's another player from the east known as Apollo Go, which is a subsidiary of Baidu, which has also announced intentions to enter the United Kingdom in 2026, using not Uber as the platform for consumers, but Lyft, which has about 20% of the ride-sharing market share here in London. So this leads to this sort of commercial race as to different companies wanting to provide this service so that they can become the star of Europe, as well as many tourists come to London and they could say, hey, I went on this cool little thing, it drove me from A to B, and there was no one inside and it felt very safe. At least that's the ideal. And therefore, it can lead to expansions, maybe even to better.
I think I read somewhere that when Uber integrate with these self-driving platforms, it's going to be the case of when people use Uber, they'll just press a button on the app as if to order a ride normally, and then the app will choose whether they get a human or an autonomous car. So that's almost like how they're going to be sort of introduced. It's not like we'll have to go on and choose, I want a self-driving ride. It will choose for us, and it will just turn up and there'll be no driver, and people will be like, oh, fair enough, that's it then.
Yeah, that is a model which does exist right now in many of the cities that Waymo operates in San Francisco and in Austin. However, there's actually more of a focus on what will work here. There might be take on rides from the actual app itself of Waymo. But Waymo might introduce, or Wave might introduce its own app in the future. There might be also certain options. For example, in Qatar, is now a ride-hailing service provided by the Chinese firm Apollo Go. And just recently on Uber, you can now choose specifically, I want a autonomous option. So they actually are still mix and matching between this. They haven't decided what the set standard will look like, and it's a mix between what people prefer in different cities, which I think is a good thing.
So, Tim, we've talked about Waymo. You've mentioned Wave. Now, the Wave I find is a really fascinating company. I think we've talked about them on the pod before because, like you say, they are British. They've raised like $1 billion in various investment things. So I won't get into it now, but the technology that underlies it is slightly different to Waymo's approach to autonomy. Could we be really looking at like Britain cleaning up here and coming out with the big company that takes over? Or do you think Waymo still stand a bit better chance of being the Uber of self-driving?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I don't think it's a set deal yet. It's actually a very open court. What's really fascinating about Wave is that they're approaching this whole question and technology very differently, in the sense of what they call an autonomous vehicle 2.0 approach, which is entirely machine learning and AI model neural network driven, meaning that from thousands and thousands, hundreds of millions of miles of data of real case driving, they inform how their vehicles should perform in different scenarios. And recently they did this roadshow where they let their vehicle go on 90 different cities in 90 different days, which is something that Waymo vehicles just cannot do because they need to map out an area and have a full understanding of the road network of the city they're in before they are able to drive above human safety standard, which is always kind of a benchmark that at least these two companies are very clearly aiming for. Another fascinating thing about Wave is that it can be retrofitted into different vehicles, and therefore they did one trial with an Asda van. So you can imagine your grocery delivery inside there's one of the big Asda vans, and there might not be even any driver for it. This would have very large implications for longer-term logistics as well. If they manage to crack motorways, which seem to be a unique problem for this sort of technology, then you could imagine that instead of being a lorry driver who has to drive 6-hour shifts, you could be more of a city-based lorry driver, moving the vehicles from the motorway over to a particular commercial depot at this transitionary stage where these vehicles might not still be able to go on unmarked roads, industrial sites, or no sites without any signs as well. These are still sometimes challenges for these vehicles.
One of the things I find kind of fascinating is that the sort of public perception of players and the technology they have is, and in some ways the market perception is slightly at odds with what we're kind of talking about here, because we're talking about companies like Waymo and Wave and so on. Obviously, you look at someone like Tesla and people argue their massive valuation is because of their self-driving technology, but they're actually kind of nowhere in here. And obviously other car manufacturers have been making big strides there. So it's kind of fascinating that it's these startups that are coming into this space and dominating, or at least so far. And yet these big established car manufacturers and fleet manufacturers don't seem to have been able to come into that space.
I guess, we're talking about vehicles and the name Volkswagen hasn't come up. A lot of these original equipment manufacturers, it's just what autonomy space calls them, which is a little bit degrading, perhaps, names them. And I guess it's mostly because this technology has burnt a lot of people before. There was the case of a self-driving vehicle startup or subsidiary known as Cruise, which was part of General Motors. Unfortunately, they did not pass the safety test. They had an incident and they were eventually taken down. I believe they were a startup and then they were acquired by General Motors, but then also shut down by General Motors. It requires a different set of thinking. It requires a completely different set of revenue model as well. And it's not the case that these big vehicles companies aren't in the fray. Toyota, in fact, has done this big government-backed trial, or big for the technology, small in terms of 2 cars, that was in Woolwich, in London, and somewhere outside of London as well, and it was known as Evolve AD, without the E at the end and AD. And I think that was a mix of wave technology behind it as well, but please do not hold me too closely to that claim. There's also Nissan, which has signed a deal publicly with Wave to try to embed their technology in here as well. So I guess it's a question of like, where is Apple in the AI game? Someone in there missed the spot, right? And they didn't have the resources. And there will be now cases of this sort of technology being licensed over to existing vehicles as well. So yeah, you very well could see, I don't know, your fancy Prius with a self-driving tech inside of it sometime in the later future, as personal vehicle ownership still has a few notches to fill out.
I mean, it takes a great visionary to imagine me in a Prius, but what?
I try to be a futurist, Martin. You never know what uncertainty is holding in the 2030s.
So Tim, right? So we think autonomous vehicles are going to be hitting Britain's roads probably in the next year. You've said that London could be the global robotaxi capital by 2028. But when these vehicles are introduced, surely someone will get them introduced. One of these companies will get their services up and running. When that happens, that's going to be a hugely controversial moment. Taxi drivers are notoriously quite activist in they're happy to drive with their taxis in front of Parliament and block up Whitehall and things like that to protest.
Phone into LBC.
Exactly. LBC are going to be furious. You're going to just turn on the radio and it's just going to be someone ranting endlessly for weeks when this happens. Uber drivers as well, they're not going to be very happy because obviously there will be, presumably if this technology does work as intended, loads of Uber drivers will lose their jobs. Probably be the first time Uber drivers and taxi drivers have ever been on the same side of an argument. So how can we avoid this being sort of a massive shit show, basically? Is there anything that can be done to make this transition work a little bit more gently in somewhere like London, rather than like California where people were setting Waymos on fire, I think, when they launched in Los Angeles? So how do we deal with that mess that surely is approaching?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. And I think it's something that isn't immediately clear for many people. Right now, I think what a lot of these companies will say, and partially even what the government might say, in response to particular backlash, this is only a trial. This is only a temporary demo of this technology. We are not trying to change the industry. However, in practice, why would you demo out this technology if you're not trying to introduce it? There are a few ways you can go about it, I think. One of them is to really make the safety case in the sense of there's been about 5,000, I believe, road fatalities in 2023 in the United Kingdom. That is something that nobody wants to be affected by. And I think the technology will be able to prove itself to meaningfully reduce in the longer term. When it comes to jobs, you can have community programs. You can have this communication. Hey, we're going to enter this part of London in this many months' time. In fact, I was once at a conference with the head of Europe at Waymo. I think his name is Ben Lowenstein. And he said the first thing they do when they come into a new area is to start these discussions, start these conversations. Now, how much do conversations matter when you actually want to still get paid and still have a job is really, really open to discussion. And I think I'm not quite sure how much the government wants to have responsibility over this and worker retraining programs or not. And it is important, and there isn't very good data on this, particularly because in the United States, most private vehicle hire workers work part-time. being an Uber driver is something you do on top of your day job, rather than being your full 9 to 5, your breadwinning circumstance. So there is also less data on this. So I think being proactive on the Department for Transport and some communication teams, especially around London boroughs as well, which will unfortunately be the target from this, whether they are responsible or not, is very, very prudent.
So we've talked a lot about the cars themselves and the people who are going to drive the cars, but obviously the story of the 20th century, which I won't go into at length, but basically we develop cars. They have a transformational impact on our lives, but also our built environment, the spaces that we inhabit, the way that we kind of move around things. And we've built this entire sprawling infrastructure to support them. I think one of the interesting stories of electric cars and EVs in the last several years is people realizing, okay, yes, it's great that you have this technology, but that's not going to take off unless you've got the infrastructure in place to support that technology. So if you look at these, let's say we have fleets of thousands, tens of thousands of self-driving cars in London. I don't know how many taxis there are, but it must be tens of thousands, somewhere in that sort of order of magnitude. Where do they live? Where do they charge? What's the infrastructure that we have to kind of build in London or elsewhere to manage all of this? Are we even working on that?
Yeah, that is the question that needs to be looked into now, essentially, because in London, things aren't built quickly, or in Britain as a whole.
You've heard our podcast before then.
So for this to go well, and for people to actually benefit, and for mobility options to be easier, and for transport to be cheaper, and for all these good things to happen, particularly if you're disabled, you'll be actually able to move between your workplace very easily because you might have this vehicle which is a cost which can be not burdensome, right? Compared to, unfortunately, today, that's not something you hear about, right? People taking a taxi to work immediately. All of this requires several things. First is the laws, the regulations, and the United Kingdom set up the Automated Vehicles Act in 2024 and is setting up a regulatory environment by the end of next year, on schedule, would you believe, where they want to make sure, hey, you are responsible for this, you are responsible for this, you are responsible for that, which is extremely important, and nothing can get started without that. And then, where will these vehicles get charged? Where will they get cleaned? Who will do the cleaning? What will you do if the vacuum cleaners are slightly too loud, if you want to put it too close to a residential area? That's a problem in Santa Monica that actually happened, and guess who got all the grief for it? The Santa Monica Local Council. So it is a question of depots, it's a question of whether industrial sites could be repurposed, and also how much authority will land in the building of charging points or even depots. Right now, there's actually this very important and complicated system as to where a taxi can park, where can a taxi drive between A to B, which roads and bus lanes are available to them and which ones aren't. As far as I'm aware, most of these conversations aren't happening. And a lot of these companies aren't having a lot of these discussions with local government, the assembly. There's definitely some level on the national government. But yeah, it's about the granular things. We know from the e-bikes that if you don't think about the details, you're going to have a line bike blocking your front door on your pavement, right?
Well, this is exactly the kind of example, right? So currently now we have line bikes. You rent one, you pick it up, you cycle it, you get to your destination, you step off it, it breaks your leg, then you leave it on the pavement, you go off in an ambulance, and the line bike just sort of sits there. And gradually there's just piles of bikes on the pavements and everyone's in hospital. And obviously Waymo cars, hopefully fewer casualties, but same principle, right? What happens if I wake up in the morning and there's a Waymo parked across the end of my driveway or something? Who deals with that?
So I want to kind of allay the fears a little bit. First of all, for those outside of London, which might get a false impression, I do not see piles of commuters and shoddy helmets piled on top of each other from line bikes. And these will be geofenced. These will be limited regional sort of trials at first. I think many of those questions hopefully will be in the process of resolution or fully resolved realistically before even a single Waymo goes that south of the river.
Steady on. I'm not sure we have the technology for that.
I live south of a river, so I'd like to also not build any divisions that are unnecessary here. Yeah, so essentially these will be geofenced areas, and then the question is like, how much can you forecast ahead of like realistic problems? And luckily, Waymo has driven 96 million miles, and they are actually kind of open to sharing a lot of that data sets. We know that roughly in a 6-month period last year, there were roughly 45 sort of collisions or crashes that Waymos were involved in. One of them was because a wheel popped off and rolled away from the car itself. So, okay, but what do you do? Because now the Waymo is stuck, right? Also, these self-driving cars so far do not understand hand signals, which is a really important thing for a city or any area which is full of roadworks, right? You need mitigation efforts.
Yeah,
there's
because
already
London
been
cabbies are
communications.
expert with hand signals. I see them quite,
Yes, in fact, they have a
especially
wide
towards
vocabulary.
cyclists.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of these are being resolved right now, and some of them have models in previous cities in California or in Texas which can be transferred over, and some of them less so. So, for example, emergency services in California have an ability to disperse a bunch of Waymos, but that's something that has to be actually communicated. And you say, hey, London Fire Brigade, hey, Met Police, we need to build systems here.
And that's really important because we talk about this sort of transition. We say, oh, we're just going to take the cabbie out of the car and we'll have, an AI in there instead that'll drive the taxi and give you unsolicited opinions about Keir Starmer and all that kind of stuff. And that's great. But then you have the kind of the responsibility piece of this and all the stuff around it. So if there's a taxi driver, there is an accountable human being in the front seat who I can kind of deal with, and they're registered. If they're a black cab driver, for example, there are kind of avenues where you know how to deal with that situation if something goes wrong. But here you've got this sort of less accountable multi-billion-dollar company and you're sort of in their hands, and there's less of that sort of direct accountability, I guess, that when we've got to sort of build the frameworks to provide that to people, I guess, for them to have confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to say that like these companies have the incentive for things to go all well. Like, they do not want to be on the front of the Sun newspaper. Will they be? Inevitably, most likely, yes. But they want to avoid recurring appearances. And currently, if there is a responsibility for these vehicles to respond to passengers in case of need. So there is actually someone on the other side which can call in. There's a microphone. Most of the time that is not in use, but you can call in and then someone can pick up the phone and you can explain the situation to them. There's no such thing as remote control for these cars. This is important to clarify. There's only suggestions. You can tell you should back up, Mr. Vehicle, and the vehicle will back up in its own right, which also should be safer because remote control driving is obviously less safe than just being in the vehicle yourself, right? And in terms of a breakdown of responsibility, I would like to give some credit to some small, unknown government workers in the Center for Connected and Automated Vehicles, the CCAV, which is this body between the Department for Transport and the Department for Business and Trade, which are thinking about these questions of the hardest. And a man called Simon Connick single-handedly, in fact, saved the Automated Vehicles Act because it only passed 2 days before the general election was called. He knew that he had little time to work with. So this sort of responsibility as to what happens when the vehicle is in control, what happens when the vehicle isn't in control, who gets fined, what are the systems here, are actively being thought about, actually. So this is one part where I'm more certain of, for sure.
Cool. So, Tim, one last question before we let you go. Let's say in a few years' time, we reconvene to talk more, and we look back on the rollout of autonomous vehicles in London and Britain more broadly. What do you think we're going to say surprised us the most?
Ooh, fantastic question. I think the most surprising thing will be where these vehicles actually end up being used. So, for example, right now, it would be ideal if you get an autonomous bus taking you around the suburbs of your town so that you can make it to the high street, to the city center easier. Is that actually going to happen? maybe, maybe not. I can imagine this being very, very important for London commuters as well. If they really knack the motorway system, that's probably the worst thing to happen to Great Western Railway that you could. And that would have larger economic impacts. I think at that stage, we will be able to determine whether certain cities can boom or not, because there'll be a larger labor pool that will be available to them. Now, that's a little bit like dependence, because there's also a world where we decide this technology isn't for us, or it's too dangerous, or something else, meaning that maybe in a few years' time it will be a gimmick in, Canary Wharf and a few other areas. I think that's less likely, to be honest, mostly because I've seen these kind of trials being developed across the world, meaning that different cultures are trying to find a way to work with this technology that works them.
I think that's going to be the fascinating thing, is that we tend to talk about these things in terms of existing journeys and trips that are being made, and would it replace those, taxi rides and the commute to work and that kind of stuff. But as we've seen with Uber and their expansion into things like meal delivery, grocery shopping, other areas, actually when you make this kind of technology cheap and abundant and accessible, it opens up all sorts of other things that we haven't necessarily thought of. So it'll be fascinating to see what comes along.
So, Tim, it's been really fascinating talking to you. We'll put links to your Substack and your work all on the abundancepod.com website. But for now, Tym Syrytczyk, thank you very much.